Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with our feature, Suzanne Corkin, who died recently at the age of 79. She was a neuroscientist PhD and one of the most important neuroscientists of the 20th century because she had a large part in establishing the basis for human memory. She became the primary researcher with the most famous patient in memory work, a patient known as HM in every neurology and psychology textbook. His real name was Henry Molaison, and when he was a young man, he had surgery for intractable seizures. In the early 1950s, they used to do a lot of that surgery. That was at McGill University. During the surgery, he had small parts of his deep brain excised, a portion called the hippocampus. After the surgery, he had fewer seizures, and he was otherwise perfectly normal, except he no longer had any short-term memory. Two of the people working with him post-operatively were the great Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield and a brilliant neuro PhD at McGill named Brenda Milner. Human memory is a complex function. It requires creation, retrieval, and storage, and they postulated that the hippocampus was critical to that. Suzanne Corkin was a PhD student studying with Brenda Milner, and they both worked together on HM. Since HM lived in the United States and Connecticut, when Dr. Corkin graduated from McGill, she went to MIT, and she was the primary follow-up for HM for over 40 years. It was her work, along with Dr. Milner, that is some of the most important in the science of human memory. Here is the story of H.M. Henry Molaison.
On September 1st, 1953, William Scoville used a hand crank and a cheap drill saw to bore into a young man's skull, cutting away vital pieces of his brain and sucking them out through a metal tube. But this wasn't a scene from a horror film or a gruesome police report. Dr. Scoville was one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of his time, and the young man was Henry Molaison, the famous patient known as HM, whose case provided amazing insights into how our brains work. As a boy, Henry had cracked his skull in an accident and soon began having seizures, blacking out, and losing control of bodily functions. After enduring years of frequent episodes and even dropping out of high school, the desperate young man had turned to Dr. Scoville, a daredevil known for risky surgeries. Partial lobotomies had been used for decades to treat mental patients, based on the notion that mental functions were strictly localized to corresponding brain areas. Having successfully used them to reduce seizures in psychotics, Scoville decided to remove HM's hippocampus, a part of the limbic system that was associated with emotion, but whose function was unknown. At first glance, the operation had succeeded. HM's seizures virtually disappeared, with no change in personality, and his IQ even improved. But there was one problem. His memory was shot. Besides losing most of his memories from the previous decade, HM was unable to form new ones, forgetting what day it was, repeating comments, and even eating multiple meals in a row. When Scoville informed another expert, Wilder Penfield, of the results, he sent a PhD student named Brenda Milner to study HM at his parents' home, where he now spent his days doing odd chores and watching classic movies for the first time, over and over. What she discovered through a series of tests and interviews didn't just contribute greatly to the study of memory. It redefined what memory even meant. One of Milner's findings shed light on the obvious fact that although HM couldn't form new memories, he still retained information long enough from moment to finish a sentence or find the bathroom. When Milner gave him a random number, he managed to remember it for 15 minutes by repeating it to himself constantly. But only 5 minutes later, he forgot the test had even taken place. Neuroscientists had thought of memory as monolithic, all of it essentially the same, and stored throughout the brain. Milner's results were not only the first clue for the now familiar distinction between short-term and long-term memory, but showed that each uses different brain regions. We now know that memory formation involves several steps. After immediate sensory data is temporarily transcribed by neurons in the cortex, it travels to the hippocampus, where special proteins work to strengthen the cortical synaptic connections. If the experience was strong enough, or we recall it periodically in the first few days, the hippocampus then transfers the memory back to the cortex for permanent storage. HM's mind could form the initial impressions, but without a hippocampus to perform this memory consolidation, they eroded. like messages scrawled in sand. But this was not the only memory distinction Milner found. In a now famous experiment, she asked H.M. to trace a third star in the narrow space between the outlines of two concentric ones, while he could only see his paper and pencil through a mirror. Like anyone else performing such an awkward task for the first time, he did horribly. But surprisingly, he improved over repeated trials, even though he had no memory of previous attempts. His unconscious motor centers remembered what the conscious mind had forgotten. What Milner had discovered was that the declarative memory of names, dates, and facts is different from the procedural memory of riding a bicycle or signing your name. And we now know that procedural memory relies more on the basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures that were intact in H.M.'s brain. This distinction between knowing that and knowing how has underpinned all memory research since. H.M. died at the age of 82 after a mostly peaceful life in a nursing home. Over the years, he had been examined by more than 100 neuroscientists, making his the most studied mind in history. Upon his death, his brain was preserved and scanned before being cut into over 2,000 individual slices and photographed to form a digital map down to the level of individual neurons, all in a live broadcast watched by 400,000 people. Though H.M. spent most of his life forgetting things, he and his contributions to our understanding of memory will be remembered for generations to come.
Here's Dr. Corkin on public radio explaining her relationship with H.M.
Suzanne has written a wonderful book called Permanent Present Tense, The Unforgettable Life of the Amnesic Patient H.M. She worked with him for 47 years. And given that long history, the first question I asked Suzanne was, when you asked him whether he knew you, what did he say?
He said yes, and he thought he knew me from high school. How did this come about? Well, I met him in 1962 when I was at McGill. From 1966 on, we studied him at MIT. He had 40 admissions to the MIT Clinical Research Center, and these were typically 1, 2, or even 3-week admissions. So he heard my name a lot from his caregivers, and of course when he was at MIT, and I introduced myself to him on numerous occasions. He saw my face over and over and over again. So with this sort of constant repetition of my name and my face, he developed a sense of familiarity for me. Have we ever met before, you and I?
Yes, I think we have.
Where?
Well, in high school.
In high school?
Yes.
Have we ever met any place besides high school?
Well, to tell you the truth, I can't. No, I don't think so.
Why am I here now?
Well, you just having an interview with me. That's what I think right now.
That book they mentioned, The Unforgettable Life of the Amnesic Patient H.M., is a wonderful book, by the way. I read it. I recommend to anybody who's interested in memory. Here is Suzanne Corkin talking about Alzheimer's disease late in life.
I think if $5 billion were available, tremendous headway would be made. I think the biggest opportunity is technology. In neuroscience, technology is making giant leaps forward every week, every month. And with all of the new ways of examining the brain at the cellular molecular level, with imaging and with recording activity in the brain, modeling what the brain does, I think that there are just unforeseen advances, tremendous advances that are possible.
Well, we're going to move on now to Judge Marcus Gordon, who died recently at the age of 84. He was the Mississippi judge who was in charge of the trial of Edgar Killen, the only man who was ever indicted for the murder of 3 civil rights workers in the summer of 1964, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney. It's the famous Mississippi burning case. We talked about it before when we did the Joseph Rao podcast. There were a number of people who were indicted for violation of the civil workers' civil rights several months after the bodies were found. But no one was indicted for murder until the case was reopened decades later, and Killen was put on trial in Judge Gordon's courtroom. Here's Mississippi television station WDAM on the death of Judge Marcus Gordon.
Well, he was most well known as the Mississippi burning judge. Retired Circuit Judge Marcus Gordon handled the nationally publicized trial of Edgar Ray Killen, who was accused of the murders of 3 civil rights workers. Well, Judge Gordon died early this morning at St. Dominic Hospital. Maggie Wade has more on his life and his career.
Judge Marcus Gordon was known to run a firm but fair courtroom. Judge Gordon retired almost 3 months ago in March. At the time of his retirement, Supreme Court Chief Justice Bill Waller Jr. said he was the longest-serving circuit judge in Mississippi. He served as circuit judge for Leake, Neshoba, Newton, and Scott counties for about 37 years. Gordon handled the highly publicized trial of Edgar Lee Killen that made national headlines in 2005. Killen was tried and convicted in the 1964 deaths of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Neshoba County. Judge Gordon sentenced him to 60 years. Killen, who is 91, is still in prison. Judge Gordon is being remembered across the state by those who knew him, including Attorney General Jim Hood, who said he liked and respected his John Wayne persona, but knew he had a kind heart.
For those unfamiliar, here's a brief review of the Freedom Summer murders of 1964 that rocked the country.
On August 4th, 1964, the search for 3 missing civil rights activists came to a tragic end. They had been shot to death after last being seen a month and a half earlier, on June 21st. The men were in Mississippi organizing black citizens to vote. Michael Schwerner, or Mickey as many knew him, and Andrew Goodman were white New Yorkers. Schwerner and Goodman traveled to the heavily segregated South to work with the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. They were working with James Chaney, a black CORE worker from Mississippi. As part of their mission, they were helping a black church in the small town of Longdale create an organizing center for the voter registration drive. That angered local members of the Ku Klux Klan, and on June 16, 1964, the Klansmen torched the church. The trio set out to investigate the church burning and were stopped by a Philadelphia, Mississippi deputy sheriff, Cecil Price. It turned out that Price was a KKK member and had been watching them. He arrested the 3 and jailed them in Philadelphia, but released them about 7 hours later. He then escorted them out of town, but they didn't get far. A group of Klansmen caught up to the 3 CORE workers, and Deputy Price eventually joined them. They were taken to a remote area where they were shot and killed. Then their bodies were buried in an earthen dam. With tips from an FBI informant, their bodies were found on August 4th. Later that year, 19 men were indicted for violating the civil rights of the 3 men. At their trial, an all-white jury found 7 of them guilty, including Deputy Price. 9 were acquitted, and the jury deadlocked on the other 3.
Well, we're going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close tonight with Jane Fawcett, who died recently at the age of 95. She was one of the Debs of Bletchley Park. She was one of the women working in the top-secret English facility that helped break the German Enigma code, and we talked about that a lot when we did the Mavis Beatty podcast. Jane Fawcett's main role was in helping locate the Bismarck, Germany's mightiest battleship that became the subject of an all-out search in the North Atlantic by the English after the Bismarck sunk the HMS Hood, which was England's mightiest battleship, in the Battle of the Denmark Strait in May of 1941. The sinking of the Bismarck is the stuff of legend. It was the subject of the great 1960 movie Sink the Bismarck with Kenneth More and Dana Winter, but it was largely through intelligence that it was done. Miss Fawcett figured out that a decoded message from the Luftwaffe Enigma contained a question by a Luftwaffe general about the status of his son who was on the Bismarck. The ship had been damaged during the battle with the Hood and was racing toward Brittany and the French port of Brest, where the Germans could repair it and relaunch it secretly. So the British had only a narrow window of time to locate it before it made it to Brest, and Miss Fawcett was instrumental in locating the ship. What else can we close with as a tribute to Miss Fawcett? But the great 1960 song by Johnny Horton about the sinking of the most fearsome battleship of World War II.
6 long days they tried to find her trail. Churchill told the people, whatever ship was sail, 'cause somewhere on that ocean, I know she's gotta be. We gotta sink the Bismarck to the bottom of the sea. They find that German battleship is making such a fuss. We gotta sink the Bismarck 'cause the world depends on us. Hey, the decks are running, boys, and spin those guns around. When we find the Bismarck, we gotta cut her down.